By sunrise, the city was eerily quiet. Not a single horn, not a single siren. The streets glistened with overnight rain, reflecting the fractured glow of street lamps. And yet, inside the grand hall of the capital circle, chaos had already begun. A single broadcast flickered to life. The pardon broadcast. The event that had promised reassurance and instead delivered shock. President Arcanghel's speech, carefully rehearsed, unfolded like a performance the world would remember. His words were deliberate, measured, almost soft, yet every syllable carried the weight of inevitability. "You cannot rewrite the past," he began. A pause. The camera lingered on his hands, slightly trembling beneath the mahogany podium. And yet, we can choose what the future remembers. The audience held their breath. Even the most seasoned journalists in the circle felt the room constrict, as though reality itself had taken a sudden, uneven breath. Then something happened. A single detail, a line meant to comfort, instead sparked a storm. "The pardons issued will secure trust. The path is clear, and all who oppose will see the consequences." No one expected it. Not the advisors, not the governors, not even the aides who had slept only a few hours, working through endless night calls, red eyes flickering like low wattage bulbs. Because what the broadcast didn't reveal, and what everyone watching would later realize, was the subtle shift beneath the circle. Power had begun to move quietly, almost invisibly. A wave had started, one that would ripple through every room, every office, every screen. Someone whispered in the back, "This isn't about the pardons, it's about control." But no one dared repeat it aloud, not yet. In the control room, monitors hummed, screens reflected anxious faces. Every feed, every camera angle, every microphone was being watched. And then a static burst. A camera in the East Wing directive cut out. The lights flickered. A door clicked shut somewhere in the building. A subtle cue. A message. The real story hadn't even started. Because outside the grand hall, in streets lined with diners and shuttered shops, Americans were already feeling the tremors. Not in politics, not in policy, but in the quiet, uneasy certainty that what they thought they understood about power might no longer apply. Arcangel paused again. His eyes scanned the hall, briefly catching a glance of the figure no one else had noticed. A young analyst, barely out of college, staring at the screens with a mix of fear and awe. She had been the one to notice the anomaly, the line that didn't fit, the document that seemed misplaced, and she had tried to warn the circle. But warnings in the capital circle rarely traveled upwards. "You know this feeling?" she muttered under her breath. "You felt this once, haven't you?" A camera caught it, though no one outside the control room would see. The broadcast continued. The words, now rehearsed and precise, carried on into the night, each phrase a ripple through the unseen networks, and outside, life went on. Highways stretched empty beneath the rising sun. A diner's neon sign flickered awake. Somewhere, a dog barked. Somewhere else, a child laughed. But inside the circle, inside the building where decisions shape lives, without anyone outside knowing, the storm was brewing. Because the pardon speech, meant to consolidate power, to reassure, to command, had already begun to unravel the very threads it was designed to secure. Screens lit up, voices sharpened, files were moved, calls intercepted, and the analyst realized. He looks out over the city lights, diners glowing faintly, highways alive with movement, people going about their lives, unaware of the network quietly balancing itself. "You've seen this before," he says softly, "but now you understand the depth beneath the surface." Zoran realizes a truth the operator made clear through trials, shocks, and ripples. Systems are alive. and humans exist within them, not above them, not separate from them. Every choice carries consequence. Every observation requires judgment. Every act of understanding demands responsibility. The Republic is resilient, not because it is unbreakable, not because it is controlled, but because it is continuously observed, understood, and guided by those who perceive it fully. Zoran steps back from the terminal. The pulse continues, steady, alive. He knows he is part of something larger, something eternal in rhythm and consequence. He speaks softly more to himself than anyone else. Freedom isn't inherited, it's practiced. Awareness isn't passive, it must be engaged. And when your moment comes, what will you choose to become? A final pause, a breath, the lights flicker, a door clicks, the world continues. And maybe this is where everything begins again. The pulse fades into quiet. The network rests, but its lessons linger. For Zoran, for the Republic, for all who dare to observe, adapt, and act. The path forward is not what anyone thinks, and the real danger isn't the speech itself, it's who now holds the definition of truth. By sunrise, the celebration had soured, and no one could explain why. But the real story hadn't even started. She wasn't supposed to be here. Not in the East Wing, not in the corridors where whispered decisions carved futures, not at the heart of a storm she hadn't even realized was forming. Her name was Lila Mercer, barely 24, yet somehow she carried the weight of decades in her posture, in the careful way she typed, in the stillness of her gaze. She had grown up in a small town off the interstate where neon signs hummed all night, diners never closed, and the smell of fried onions mixed with the rain. Her father, a mechanic with oil-stained hands, taught her early, things break, people too, always notice what's missing. A childhood scar ran across her left wrist, a bicycle crash at age 9, nothing life-threatening, but enough to remind her daily that balance was fragile. Her mother, quiet and watchful, had always said, some things can't be fixed with a wrench, and Lila had believed her, until she found herself in the capital circle where nothing broke, but everything bent in ways that made the world harder to read. She carried a private fear, a low hum in her chest that whispered at night, what if you're too small to matter? It wasn't arrogance, not quite ambition. It was a quiet dread that people would move through history while she remained unseen, unheard, irrelevant. And yet, she had a dream. To see systems not as walls of power, but as machines of logic mechanisms that could be understood, predicted, maybe even fixed. Late nights, she would sit in her apartment, watching grainy political footage, not for entertainment, but to trace patterns. Fingers on the keyboard, coffee cold, the hum of her fridge like a distant engine. She had learned the rhythm of power through observation, through subtle inconsistencies, through the moments everyone else ignored. You've seen this before, maybe in someone you once met, someone who looked ordinary, and yet could spot the tremors that others mistook for stillness. Her first clue had come months ago, a mislabeled memo, a contradiction in a security feed, something small enough to be dismissed and big enough to unsettle her sleep for weeks. She had tried to warn her supervisors, check this again, she'd said, voice steady, even though her stomach quivered. But warnings in the circle rarely traveled upward. They bounced back, dismissed as oversensitivity. And yet, she remembered one phrase her father had said long ago, beneath the humming neon of the diner, notice what's missing. It'll tell you more than what's there. That advice echoed now, louder than any alarm. Something in the circle was shifting. It wasn't obvious, not yet. But Lila felt it like a tremor under her feet, a current running through the building that everyone else ignored, and there was one detail everyone missed. The pardon broadcast hadn't just failed, it had revealed. Revealed the cracks no one wanted to see. Revealed the fragility of control. Revealed opportunity. Her eyes traced the monitors. The anomalies flickered, almost imperceptible. A paused feed, a delayed transmission, the slightest hesitance in a voice she had studied for weeks. But something else stirred inside her. Not fear, not hope. Something sharper, recognition. A pattern, one that had been there all along, waiting for someone to notice. And as she leaned back in her chair, the city lights bleeding into her apartment window, she whispered almost to herself, he just didn't know what was coming. Because in the capital circle, where whispers became law and law became silence, Lila had already begun to see the invisible threads, and the question that haunted her, the question she would chase for weeks to come, what happens when no one controls the definition of truth? But because it is continuously observed, understood, and guided by those who perceive it fully, Zoran steps back from the terminal. The pulse continues, steady, alive. He knows he is part of something larger, something eternal in rhythm and consequence. He speaks softly more to himself than anyone else. Freedom isn't inherited, it's practiced. Awareness isn't passive, it must be engaged. And when your moment comes, what will you choose to become? A final pause, a breath, the lights flicker, a door clicks, the world continues. And maybe this is where everything begins again. The pulse fades into quiet. The network rests, but its lessons linger. For Zoran, for the Republic, for all who dare to observe, adapt, and act. The answer wasn't coming from the speech. It wasn't coming from the president. It wasn't coming from anyone in power. It would come from her. And for the first time, Lila felt the tremor, not as fear, but as possibility. The real story hadn't even started. At first, everything looked normal. The East Wing hummed with routine, files shuffled, phones buzzed, coffee cups steamed, the kind of normal that makes you forget the fragility of the world. But then a single detail fractured everything. A message misrouted. A file marked sovereign directive appeared in Leela's inbox. She blinked, rechecked. No mistake, the anomaly was real, and with it, the first pulse of tension. At the other end of the circle, advisors whispered behind closed doors. Rules bent quietly, protocols ignored. The pardon broadcast was supposed to solidify loyalty. Instead, it triggered uncertainty. The shift was subtle. A question here, a hesitation there, a glance that lingered too long. No one could name it, but everyone felt it. The numbers don't add up, one aide murmured. Check again, another replied. But no one checked twice. Not yet. The anomaly spread like a silent virus. An overlooked report. A misaligned schedule. Each misstep compounded by human error and human curiosity. Lila noticed patterns no one else did. Small discrepancies. The East Wing security feeds out of sync. A key decision logged twice. The president's aides whispering to each other in tones heavier than their words. And then a rule shifted. Something unspoken, almost instinctual. Control had moved from the visible hierarchy to the anomalies themselves, to the people noticing the cracks. At first, the circle tried to ignore it, pretended the anomaly was a glitch, pretended the tremor wasn't there, but the tremor demanded attention. The pardon broadcast, meant to reinforce trust, had fractured expectation, and with fractured expectation came contradiction. You're supposed to approve the motion, one senior aide said. Yes, another replied, but it contradicts the directive from yesterday. Then follow yesterday, the first said. But yesterday isn't valid anymore, the second whispered. Moral pressure settled over the room like smoke. Every decision, every word, every glance became charged. The tiniest misstep could shift the balance of influence. Lila watched quietly. She had learned to read these moments. The way light refracts through glass, the way someone's hand lingers over a button as though waiting for permission from the universe. You've asked this question too. What happens when no one is really in control? The circle began to fracture in ways no one could foresee. Allies became cautious. Rivals became predators. Conversations that had always been harmless now carried weight, consequence, suspicion. And at the edge of it all, the analysts noticed something else. A micro twist in the data. A single figure whose actions didn't match the recorded orders. Someone was moving in secret. Someone with purpose. The first wave of tension hit. The rules were changing, and no one had been told. The president's aides scrambled to reassert control. Reports were cross-checked, emails resent, memos rewritten, but every correction seemed to deepen the uncertainty. At night, in her small apartment, Lila traced the anomalies across her screen. She felt the pressure rise like a tide. Each connection she made, each pattern she mapped, pulled her deeper into the circle's hidden currents. It wasn't just the speech anymore. It wasn't the pardons, the documents, the directives. It was the human element, the crack in perception, the fracture in trust. And then she found the line that would change everything. A report hidden in plain sight, revealing that the rules themselves had shifted without anyone noticing. At first, she thought it was a mistake. She checked again. No, it was deliberate. And the question that haunted her, the question she would chase for weeks to come, what happens when no one controls the definition of truth? But because it is continuously observed, understood, and guided by those who perceive it fully, Zoran steps back from the terminal. The pulse continues. Steady, alive. He knows he is part of something larger, something eternal in rhythm and consequence. He speaks softly more to himself than anyone else. Freedom isn't inherited, it's practiced. Awareness isn't passive, it must be engaged. And when your moment comes, what will you choose to become? A final pause, a breath, the lights flicker, a door clicks, the world continues. And maybe this is where everything begins again. The pulse fades into quiet. The network rests, but its lessons linger. For Zoran, for the Republic, for all who dare to observe, adapt, and act. The real danger isn't change, she whispered. It's who controls the definition of normal. And at that moment, the tension became tangible. The storm had begun. But no one outside the circle would feel it yet. The city slept. The diners stayed lit. Highways stretched empty beneath the rising moon. Inside, however, every step Lila took, every breath she drew, echoed through a system that was no longer predictable. A subtle war had begun, silent, invisible, and it would ripple outward. By the time anyone realized it, the rules would already be different, and the real story hadn't even started. No one outside the circle understood what was happening. Not the reporters, not the citizens scanning the morning feeds, not the pundits dissecting a speech that already felt incomplete. Because the real story wasn't in the speech. It wasn't in the pardons. It wasn't in the words broadcast to millions. The real story was here, behind the glass walls, behind the locked doors, behind the hum of monitors and the click of keyboard. Lila Mercer leaned over the console, her eyes tracing patterns across multiple screens. Each feed, each file, each timestamp revealed a system almost no one had noticed. A system built on invisible hierarchies, on curated chaos, on carefully orchestrated dependencies. What they called order was improvisation. What they called freedom was quiet compliance. What they called loyalty was algorithmically monitored submission. And here's the part almost no one saw. The anomalies weren't mistakes. They were signals, test pulses, markers, probes, a machine of human decisions feeding itself while claiming to serve the people. Lila realized with a shiver she could not shake that the pardon broadcast had been designed to expose weakness. Not weakness in her or the president or the circle, but weakness in the system itself. A paradox unfolded before her eyes. To consolidate power, they had to reveal its fragility. To enforce loyalty, they had to invite dissent. To maintain control, they had to cede unpredictability. She felt the weight of it in her chest, a low electric pressure like a storm trapped under glass. And yet, she couldn't turn away. She had never seen anything like it. And now she understood why. The East Wing Directive, the carefully coded reports, the overlooked anomalies, all part of a pattern that moved beyond politics or personalities. It was the logic of the circle itself. And within that logic, one simple truth crystallized: you can control the machine. You can't control the currents within it. A whisper from the control room cut through the hum. The pattern is alive. Lila froze. No one else could hear it. But she understood. Everything she had studied, all the late nights, all the anomalies, led to this revelation. The system had a rhythm. It had rules, yes, but it also had gaps. And those gaps could be exploited. She followed one anomaly further. A set of files misaligned by seconds. A security feed paused for a heartbeat. A voice slightly off script. And then she saw a line in the sovereign file that no one had meant her to find. The blueprint of control, hiding in plain sight, revealing who really pulled the strings and how power could shift in a single, quiet moment. The revelation hit her like a punch. Everything she had assumed about influence, authority, and trust was incomplete, flawed, fragile. And the emotional precision of the system, the way it fed on expectation, on fear, on ambition, was breathtaking. You've felt this before, that sharp, dizzying moment when reality splits and you realize the rules aren't what you thought. When the machinery behind the world is more alive, more human, and more terrifying than the faces who operate it. And the question that haunted her, the question she would chase for weeks to come: what happens when no one controls the definition of truth? But because it is continuously observed, understood, and guided by those who perceive it fully, Zoran steps back from the terminal. The pulse continues, steady, alive. He knows he is part of something larger, something eternal in rhythm and consequence. He speaks softly more to himself than anyone else. Freedom isn't inherited, it's practiced. Awareness isn't passive, it must be engaged. And when your moment comes, what will you choose to become? A final pause, a breath, the lights flicker, a door clicks, the world continues. And maybe this is where everything begins again. The pulse fades into quiet. The network rests, but its lessons linger. For Zoran, for the Republic, for all who dare to observe, adapt, and act. She leaned back. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard, not ready to type, but ready to act. Because now she understood the speech hadn't failed. It had succeeded in the only way that mattered. It had revealed the hidden system. The storm wasn't outside. It wasn't on the streets or in the news. It was here, in the control room, in the gaps, in the pauses, in the silences. And the real danger? Not the change, not the speech, not the people calling themselves leaders. It was the invisible hand of the system itself. And who would define what normal looked like once the currents shifted? The lights flickered. A door clicked somewhere down the hall. Somewhere, a voice muttered something half remembered, and Lila's heart raced, because the reveal was complete. The hidden system was no longer hidden, and in its mirrored, precise, terrifying logic, she saw the first glimpse of opportunity and the first shadow of betrayal. The storm was coming, and everyone inside the circle would either ride it or be broken by it. But the real story hadn't even started. Screens lit up, voices sharpened, the hum of the capital circle became a roar. No one agreed on what was real anymore. The pardon broadcast had ignited more than questions. It had fractured certainty. And in the fractured light, Lila felt the first pangs of an awakening. It wasn't fear, not exactly. It was the pulse of truth hitting the soft underbelly of power. You can silence a voice, she whispered, almost to herself. You can bury a truth, but you cannot stop a mind that finally learns to question. Every decision, every movement in the circle was magnified now, exposed by the anomalies she had been tracking for weeks. Small fissures widened into gaps. Gaps became chasms. And the chasms threatened to swallow everything the circle had built. In the control room, aides shouted, screens glitched, microphones picked up, conversations meant to be private. Files disappeared, reappeared. And in that chaos, Lila realized this wasn't about a speech. This wasn't about pardons. This was about control itself. Her reflection caught in a darkened monitor startled her. She had been chasing patterns for months, but now the patterns were chasing her. The rules she had relied on, the boundaries she thought existed, all evaporated in the sudden heat of the storm. And the storm wasn't just professional, it was personal. Every instinct she had honed, every late-night observation, was being tested against a force she hadn't yet named. Alarms echoed through the circle, not the mechanical kind, but the kind that live inside human systems, a heightened awareness, a pressure wave running through every individual. One senior advisor's voice cracked, someone is breaking protocol. But no one could identify the culprit. No one could predict what would happen next. Lila's hands hovered over the console. She felt the currents of power, the subtle shifts, the whispers of betrayal. She felt the circle itself bending, not breaking, but bending towards something new. The moral pressure mounted. Every choice became a statement of identity. Every action a declaration of who she wanted to be and who she would not become. And in that pressure, a clarity emerged, a rhythm she hadn't noticed before. The storm was not chaos, it was truth, distilled. The circle was revealing itself not through statements or speeches, but through the fracture lines, the gaps, the whispers. Voices outside the circle had begun to rise. The public felt the tremors, though no one could articulate them. They saw headlines that didn't make sense. They felt tension in broadcasts that promised calm. They sensed change, even if they didn't know its source. Lila's heartbeat matched the cadence of the storm. She realized something fundamental. This was the moment she had been preparing for. And the question that haunted her, the question she would chase for weeks to come, what happens when no one controls the definition of truth? But because it is continuously observed, understood, and guided by those who perceive it fully, Zoran steps back from the terminal. The pulse continues. Steady, alive. He knows he is part of something larger, something eternal in rhythm and consequence. He speaks softly more to himself than anyone else. Freedom isn't inherited, it's practiced. Awareness isn't passive, it must be engaged. And when your moment comes, what will you choose to become? A final pause, a breath, the lights flicker, a door clicks, the world continues. And maybe this is where everything begins again. The pulse fades into quiet. The network rests, but its lessons linger. For Zoran, for the Republic, for all who dare to observe, adapt, and act. The moment where observation became action, analysis became power, and truth became a weapon. Screens flickered. Someone whispered in the hall. A door clicked shut. An email landed on her console, its subject line innocuous, its content explosive. The path is not what you think. Follow the anomaly. Her pulse quickened. This was it. The first thread of agency she had ever held within the heart of the circle. The storm had arrived. It had no mercy, no allegiance, no pause. It would test loyalty, skill, and courage. It would force the question everyone feared: who are you when the system you trust collapses around you? Lila felt a flicker of fear, then a spark of exhilaration. She understood suddenly, that storms could destroy or reveal. And in that understanding, she chose to watch, to learn, to act, because the storm was here, and she would no longer hide in its shadows. The lights flickered, voices sharpened, the storm was everywhere, and no one inside the circle would remain unchanged. But the real story hadn't even started. The storm had passed. Not entirely, not outside. But inside the circle, a fragile calm settled like dust after an earthquake. Lila Mercer leaned back in her chair. The hum of monitors filled the silence, faint and familiar. She could feel her pulse slowing, her breath returning to normal, and yet something deeper had shifted. She had seen the system's skeleton, its hidden currents, its quiet dependencies. And she had survived, not because she was fearless, but because she had learned to see. Freedom isn't inherited, it's practiced. The East Wing directive continued to operate, its patterns still intact, still humming beneath the surface, but the currents had changed. A single anomaly could ripple across the network, altering the flow of influence. Lila's reflection stared back from the darkened monitor. There was fatigue there, yes, and relief, and a flicker of hope, but mostly recognition. Recognition that she was part of something larger than herself. She walked through the empty corridors. The lights reflected off polished floors. Security doors clicked softly behind her. No one was there, yet she felt every presence. The weight of decisions not yet made, the tension of outcomes still untested. So when your moment comes, what will you choose to become? She paused outside the grand hall, the room where the pardon broadcast had begun, where trust had faltered, where power had shifted quietly, almost invisibly. And she realized the story wasn't over, it had only begun. Voices she had studied for months echoed in her memory, whispers that once carried uncertainty now carried lessons. Lessons about observation, patience, and choice. The storm had tested her. It had revealed the machinery of control. It had exposed the fragility of assumption, but it had also revealed possibility. And maybe this is where everything begins again. Outside, the city moved on. Neon signs flickered. Highways carried early commuters. Somewhere a dog barked. Somewhere a child laughed. The world continued, unaware of the currents beneath. And inside, Lila Mercer made a choice to act, to learn, to navigate the hidden paths that no one else dared tread. The storm had not broken her, it had illuminated her. The circle was revealing itself not through statements or speeches, but through the fracture lines, the gaps, the whispers. Voices outside the circle had begun to rise. The public felt the tremors, though no one could articulate them. They saw headlines that didn't make sense. They felt tension in broadcasts that promised calm. They sensed change, even if they didn't know its source. Lila's heartbeat matched the cadence of the storm. She realized something fundamental. This was the moment she had been preparing for. And the question that haunted her, the question she would chase for weeks to come, what happens when no one controls the definition of truth? But because it is continuously observed, understood, and guided by those who perceive it fully, Zoran steps back from the terminal. The pulse continues. Steady, alive. He knows he is part of something larger, something eternal in rhythm and consequence. He speaks softly more to himself than anyone else. Freedom isn't inherited, it's practiced. Awareness isn't passive, it must be engaged. And when your moment comes, what will you choose to become? A final pause, a breath, the lights flicker, a door clicks, the world continues. And maybe this is where everything begins again. The pulse fades into quiet. The network rests, but its lessons linger. For Zoran, for the Republic, for all who dare to observe, adapt, and act. She returned to her console. The monitors glowed softly, each one a window into possibility. And as she traced the anomalies once more, she felt the quiet certainty that power, observation, and courage could bend reality not with force, but with understanding. Freedom isn't inherited, it's practiced, and in the quiet after the storm, Lila Mercer practiced it. The calm was temporary, everyone knew it. Even if no one admitted it, Lila Mercer sat before the monitors, tracing the patterns again. Small flickers, slight inconsistencies, nothing blatant, nothing alarming, yet enough to whisper something was shifting. At first she thought it was fatigue. Maybe the circle was still recovering. Maybe the anomalies were harmless echoes of the storm. But then a feed in the East Wing directive blinked. A shadow moved across the camera, too precise to be random. A door opened that should have remained locked. A key card used twice in a row. She felt it, the pulse of the system. Not chaos, not randomness, but subtle recalibration. The circle adjusting itself to the aftermath of the broadcast, to the first tremors of doubt, to the anomalies she had uncovered. At the same time, whispers began to circulate. Advisors exchanged cryptic glances. A senior aide muttered under his breath, "The rules aren't what they were. They never were." And for the first time, Lila realized the depth of the currents she had stepped into. It wasn't just anomalies or misaligned files. It wasn't just miscommunication. It was strategy in motion. Someone was testing her. Someone was testing the circle itself. Someone was watching the watchers. "You've seen this before," she thought. "You've felt this once, haven't you?" She remembered the night she stayed up in her apartment, tracing subtle inconsistencies, learning the rhythm of hidden power. Now, the rhythm was no longer subtle. It was intentional. The anomaly she had discovered earlier, the thread of misaligned orders, misreported activity, was no longer an isolated incident. It was spreading. Like a quiet contagion. In the control room, tension rose. Voices snapped. Eyes darted to monitors. Microphones picked up conversations no one intended to hear. Files were moved before instructions were clear. Lila's pulse quickened. This was not a storm. This was a series of waves, a cascade of pressures designed to reveal weaknesses, to expose loyalties, to illuminate the fractures in control. And at the center of it, she understood her role. Not a participant, not an observer, but a navigator, a connector, the one able to read the currents before anyone else. She traced a path across the screens, a map of influence, error, and opportunity. Each line a thread in the hidden system, each anomaly a possible lever, each decision a pivot point. Someone outside the circle would see none of it. A reporter would call it confusion. The public would call it chaos. But Lila saw the design, and she felt the first thrill of agency. At that moment, the lights flickered. A door clicked shut somewhere far down the hall. A new message appeared on her console. "Follow the thread. It leads where no one is looking." She paused. Her mind raced. Every instinct screamed caution. Every observation screamed opportunity. The storm had passed, yes, but the current beneath the calm, that current was stronger than ever. And this time, it would not wait, because the circle was alive. And every anomaly, every flicker, every whisper was a signal that the game had changed. And the real story hadn't even started. The East Wing was no longer quiet. Not really. And the question that haunted her, the question she would chase for weeks to come, what happens when no one controls the definition of truth? But because it is continuously observed, understood, and guided by those who perceive it fully, Zoran steps back from the terminal. The pulse continues. Steady, alive. He knows he is part of something larger, something eternal in rhythm and consequence. He speaks softly more to himself than anyone else. Freedom isn't inherited, it's practiced. Awareness isn't passive, it must be engaged. And when your moment comes, what will you choose to become? A final pause, a breath, the lights flicker, a door clicks, the world continues, and maybe this is where everything begins again. The pulse fades into quiet. The network rests, but its lessons linger. For Zoran, for the Republic, for all who dare to observe, adapt, and act. Even in the empty corridors, tension lingered in the air. It hummed low and constant, like electricity before a storm. Lila Mercer watched the monitors, her eyes tracing every movement. A door that should have been closed opened for a moment too long. A keycard swiped without authorization. A shadow that didn't belong. At first, she thought it was a simple mistake, a human error, nothing more. But mistakes didn't move with intent. This did. Voices in the circle began to rise. Quiet disagreements turned into pointed questions. Pointed questions turned into accusations. The subtle alliances that had held for months began to fracture. Did you approve that? One aide snapped. I followed the directive, another replied. But the directive changed, didn't it? Silence. A pause that stretched longer than comfort. Lila leaned closer to her monitors. This was the first real crack in the circle. Not the anomaly itself, not the system, the people. And it was beautiful in its own way, because cracks were opportunity. The anomalies multiplied, files misaligned, feeds paused, voices repeated instructions that had never existed. And behind it all, someone or something was watching, tracking every response, every hesitation, every misstep. Lila felt a thrill. The circle, so confident, so controlled, was unraveling in slow motion. She had studied patterns for months, but now she could watch them collapse in real time. You felt this before, she reminded herself. The pulse of uncertainty, the electric charge of discovery. The first moment when the rules shift and nothing feels safe, a message appeared on her console. Short, deliberate, check the feeds. You're missing a detail everyone else overlooked. She clicked through the files. Her stomach dropped. The detail was subtle, just a shift in timing. Just a shadow where none should exist, just enough to throw the circle off balance. At the same time, her peripheral monitors picked up new movement. Someone was moving through the hallways, careful, deliberate, aware that every step could be observed, and they were looking for something or someone. In the control room, voices rose to arguments. Every decision became a moral test. Every order, a reflection of intent. And every misstep, a potential disaster. Lila traced the anomalies across her screens. Every thread connected. Every misalignment intentional. Every pause a message. The circle was no longer a monolith. It was a network of tension, observation, and hidden agendas. And the first fractures were visible to anyone who could read the currents. She felt a subtle shift within herself. Not fear, not hesitation, recognition. She understood that this was the first stage of the storm, not the broadcast, not the anomalies alone. The storm was now human. Every choice, every reaction, every secret desire was feeding the system's rhythm, and she would ride it. Not blindly, not reactively, but deliberately, because the circle was alive, and she was awake. The lights flickered. A door clicked somewhere down the hall. Somewhere, a whisper became a murmur. The first cracks had appeared, and everyone inside the circle would feel the tremor, but the real story hadn't even started. Voices clashed in the East Wing, not loud enough to be heard outside the circle, but sharp enough to cut through the hum of monitors and machines. You're bypassing protocol, one senior aide snapped, finger jabbing toward a screen. I'm following the directives. Another countered, voice tight with irritation, but the directives conflict, then someone needs to clarify. Every word carried weight. Every hesitation carried consequence. The microfractures Lila had been watching for weeks had begun to fracture the people themselves. At the center of it all, she remained still, observing, calculating, waiting. The anomalies were no longer whispers, they were instructions. And someone, somewhere, had planted them deliberately. The first betrayal revealed itself subtly. A file marked classified, restricted, appeared on a terminal that shouldn't have access. She traced the access log. Someone had moved faster than procedure allowed. Someone had anticipated the storm. Lila's pulse quickened, not with fear, but with the thrill of recognition. The circle wasn't failing by accident. It was being tested, or maybe she realized someone was controlling the test. Check the timestamps, she muttered under her breath. The anomalies aligned. A pattern emerged. Someone within the circle was orchestrating subtle chaos, feeding tension, observing reactions, and she had just discovered the key lever. At the same time, another argument erupted. One aide accused another of hiding reports that could shift decisions, influence loyalty, and alter the definition of normal. The room pulsed with frustration, suspicion, unease, and through it all, Lila traced the opportunities. Every misstep revealed a vulnerability. Every hesitation revealed intent. Every raised voice revealed fear. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard, not yet acting, but watching, always watching. For all who dared to observe, adapt, and act. You know this feeling when everything you assumed about a system crumbles in real time, when patterns you've studied begin to fracture, when opportunity and danger occupy the same heartbeat. The first real strategic move arrived as quietly as a shadow. A misaligned memo suddenly redirected attention, forcing one faction to double back to verify a decision they had already made. Time stretched, decisions stalled. The system, for all its power, slowed under its own complexity. Lila felt it, control shifting. Not complete control, not total dominance, but leverage. The smallest movement, the tiniest insight could ripple across the circle and change outcomes. Somewhere down the hall, a door clicked shut, a security light flickered, a whisper became audible. Someone was acting, watching, calculating, and Lila knew she had to act too. Not recklessly, not impulsively, but deliberately. Because the storm wasn't just a broadcast anymore. It wasn't just anomalies. It was the people themselves, their ambition, their fear, their denial. And in that crucible, she realized the truth. You can't stop the currents once you see them. She leaned into a console, analyzed, predicted, prepared. The first move of the game that no one outside the circle would understand, but everyone inside would feel. The tension had become a living thing. It pulsed through the hallways, through the monitors, through every whispered conversation. And the real story hadn't even started. Lila Mercer moved quietly. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard, then landed decisively. A single command, a subtle reroute of data. Nothing obvious, nothing traceable, and yet everything changed. The monitors flickered, feeds paused, then resumed. Reports appeared where they shouldn't. Voices paused mid-sentence. A ripple moved through the East Wing. An unease that no one could name. An instinct that something wasn't right. She watched. She measured. She calculated. Every reaction, every hesitation, every glance became data. At the same time, the circle's internal conflict escalated. One aide accused another of duplicity. Another whispered rumors of hidden agendas. The room, once orderly, vibrated with suspicion. Lila felt a surge of awareness. She understood the currents now. The micro shifts, the subtle patterns, the hidden levers. She wasn't just observing, she was participating. And participation came with risk. A shadow moved in the corridor behind her, someone monitoring her workstation. Her pulse quickened, but she remained calm, a breath measured, a mind precise. You've seen this before, she thought. The moment when observation becomes action. She leaned back, tracked the anomalies she had created. Small, subtle, strategic, enough to test responses, enough to reveal fractures. The first response came almost immediately. A memo misfiled. An instruction delayed. A senior aide questioned a decision that had already been confirmed. The circle was reacting, not to chaos, not to chance, but to her. And in that moment, Lila understood the power of leverage. The storm had taught her observation. The storm had taught her patience. Now, it would teach her influence. Every misstep she had studied, every reaction she had recorded, all led to this, a single move that could shift balance. And balance was everything. Somewhere down the hall, voices rose. A door clicked shut, a light flickered. The first confrontations were beginning, small, quiet, unnoticed outside the circle, but seismic inside it. Lila's pulse steadied, her mind sharpened. The circle's fractures were no longer invisible. They were opportunities, and she intended to use them. The storm had passed. The calm was deceptive. The currents were alive, and she was finally awake. The first move had been made. And the real story hadn't even started. The shift was subtle at first. A misaligned report here, a question raised there. No one outside the circle noticed. No one outside even suspected. Inside, the East Wing pulsed with quiet disruption. Small fissures widened. Trust frayed at the edges. Every glance carried suspicion. Every instruction carried hesitation. Lila Mercer watched, tracked, calculated. The anomalies she had triggered were doing their work. The circle was reacting, not with chaos, but with measured uncertainty. The machine of control groaned under its own weight. You felt this once, didn't you? She thought. The pulse of revelation, the sudden awareness that the world isn't as rigid as it seems, that systems bend, that patterns break. And she had just discovered the key lever. At the same time, another argument erupted. One aide accused another of hiding reports that could shift decisions, influence loyalty, and alter the definition of normal. The room pulsed with frustration, suspicion, unease, and through it all, Lila traced the opportunities. Every misstep revealed a vulnerability. Every hesitation revealed intent. Every raised voice revealed fear. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard, not yet acting, but watching, always watching. For all who dared to observe, adapt, and act. A senior aide noticed a discrepancy. Wait, this isn't what we agreed. Another raised an eyebrow. Did someone change it? Silence. Eyes shifted. Blame waited, unspoken, in the air. Every small ripple she had created was now a wave, and the circle, so confident for months, was wobbling on its own axis. Lila felt the thrill of influence. Not domination, not arrogance, but understanding. The difference was subtle but profound. Yet, even as the first domino fell, a countercurrent emerged. Someone inside the circle had noticed the pattern, someone intelligent, cautious, observant, someone who could see the anomalies weren't random, and that someone began to trace the lines backward, not for revenge, not yet, but for clarity, for control. Lila's fingers hovered over her console. Every reaction was data. Every hesitation, every blink, every subtle misstep, it all fed the rhythm she had learned. Outside, the city moved on. The lights flickered, cars hummed across highways, people went about lives unaware of the currents shifting beneath the East Wing. Inside, tension grew. Every corner held a shadow, every whisper carried weight, and the storm she had survived once was beginning to stir again. She leaned forward, traced a subtle connection on her screens. A single line of misaligned files linked two factions within the circle who had never been allies. And now, unknowingly, they were acting in tandem, exposing vulnerabilities she could exploit. The first real test of her strategy was underway. The dominoes were falling, and she had placed the first one. The lights flickered again. A door clicked in the hall. Somewhere, a voice muttered a caution that no one else heard. The circle was alive, and the currents had begun to move. But the real story hadn't even started. Tension had become visible, not just in whispers, not just in glances, but in actions. In the East Wing, doors opened and closed with intent. Voices carried over corridors, sharp and deliberate. Every movement, every hesitation, every unspoken word was a signal. Lila Mercer observed it all. Each micro-expression, every flicker on a monitor, every pause in conversation, the anomalies she had set in motion were no longer subtle. They had become catalysts. Two aides, previously aligned, argued over a misfiled directive. Neither remembered exactly why it mattered. Neither admitted to noticing the ripple that had triggered it, but the tension built anyway. Like a cord stretched too far, like glass threatening to crack. "You're missing the point," one snapped. "I'm not," the other hissed. "You don't even see it yet." And in that moment, Lila saw it all. The fractures, the subtle dependencies, the weaknesses hidden beneath pride and protocol. She leaned forward, tapped a few keys, a subtle rerouting of a report, a timestamp slightly altered, an instruction nudged to the wrong inbox. Tiny moves, invisible to all but the careful observer. Yet the effects were immediate. The argument escalated. One aide accused another of sabotage. The second denied it, eyes wide with panic. A third began taking sides, the first silent for the first time in months. The room was a tinderbox. Outside, the Capitol hum continued. Streetlights flickered. Cars rolled by. The city oblivious to the storm behind closed doors. Inside, Lila's pulse remained steady. The storm was no longer external. It was inside the circle. And she was learning to ride its currents. "You felt this before," she whispered to herself. The thrill of influence, the awareness that subtlety could bend outcomes. That power existed in observation, patience, and timing. A door clicked behind her. She didn't turn. She knew someone had entered. She knew someone was watching, but she didn't flinch. She had learned the rhythm. The storm wasn't a threat, it was a guide, and she would follow it carefully. The argument in the East Wing broke into action. Reports were duplicated, instructions misdelivered. A small faction made a move that contradicted an earlier directive. Chaos, invisible to anyone outside, began to take form, and through it all, Lila's console tracked every reaction, every hesitation, every subtle betrayal. The circle's fractures were now visible, and she held the first advantage. The lights flickered, a door clicked shut, a voice muttered in the shadows. The currents were shifting, the dominoes were falling, and the real story hadn't even started. The East Wing had become a battlefield of subtle aggression, not with weapons, not with overt hostility, but with intention. Every glance, and she had just discovered the key lever. At the same time, another argument erupted. One aide accused another of hiding reports that could shift decisions, influence loyalty, and alter the definition of normal. The room pulsed with frustration, suspicion, unease, and through it all, Lila traced the opportunities. Every misstep, revealed a vulnerability. Every hesitation revealed intent. Every raised voice revealed fear. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard, not yet acting, but watching, always watching. For all who dared to observe, adapt, and act, every pause, every carefully chosen word. Lila Mercer watched from her console. The storm she had nudged into motion was now undeniable. Two factions clashed over directives, their loyalties exposed in micro-reactions, their influence shifting in the shadows. "You knew this would happen," one aide hissed. "I had no choice," the other replied. "But someone manipulated the flow." Eyes flickered. Accusations hung heavy in the air. Lila felt the first ripple of consequence. Her subtle interventions had not gone unnoticed. Not yet openly, not yet definitively. But she could feel the tension brushing against her like electricity on skin. A file appeared on her monitor, classified unauthorized. It didn't belong there. And yet, someone had placed it with precision. Someone who understood the currents as well as she did. A whisper of panic, a flash of suspicion, the first real challenge to her control. And she smiled, quietly, not arrogance, not overconfidence, recognition. This was the moment she had been waiting for, the first test of leverage, the first dance of influence, and it would reveal everything. Down the corridor, voices escalated, orders were questioned, loyalty challenged. The first overt fracture among factions emerged. Small, almost imperceptible, but irreversible. Lila made her move. A subtle reroute of communication, a timestamp adjustment, an invisible nudge toward confusion. The effect was immediate. One faction misinterpreted instructions, the other hesitated to act. Disarray multiplied, control shifted, quietly, inevitably. She leaned back. The storm wasn't external anymore. It was human. The friction between ambition and fear, between loyalty and self-interest, was now fully visible. Somewhere in the shadows, someone watched her. Not openly, not yet, but with awareness, with calculation. And Lila knew this. Every move carried risk. Every advantage could be traced. Every ripple could become a wave. Yet she remained calm because she had learned the rhythm of the storm. And storms, she knew, were not destroyed. They were navigated. The lights flickered. A door clicked. A monitor glitched briefly. The first fractures had become visible. And the currents of influence were alive. The circle would never be the same. Not after this. Not after today. And the real story hadn't even started. The East Wing pulsed with quiet scheming, not with shouts, not with open defiance, but with deliberate movements, hidden glances, and whispered agendas. Lila Mercer observed it all. Every subtle shift, every pause that carried weight, every exchange that seemed ordinary but wasn't. Two aides lingered near a terminal, a conversation that seemed casual. But Lila's monitors revealed the truth. They were sharing more than information, they were plotting. "You understand the risk?" one whispered. "Of course," the other replied. "And yet you continue?" The answer was a nod, silent, calculated. Lila smiled faintly. Covert alliances were forming. Small, tentative, invisible to anyone not paying attention, but enough to alter outcomes, to shift influence quietly. The anomalies she had seeded amplified the effect. Instructions delayed, reports misfiled, trust fraying just enough to encourage coordination between unlikely allies. A subtle betrayal emerged. One aide diverted a directive to a private inbox. Not malicious, not overt, but significant. A tiny lever that could tilt the balance. "You've seen this before," Lila reminded herself. The tension between loyalty and ambition. The invisible web of influence. The quiet chaos that power always attracts. She traced the connections across the monitors. Every whispered conversation, every misaligned directive, every hesitant glance was a thread in a tapestry she could now read. She didn't intervene immediately, not yet, observation first. Influence second. Down the corridor, doors clicked. Footsteps approached, then faded. Voices rose, paused, lowered again. Every movement carried intent. Every glance carried warning. Lila adjusted a few parameters on her console. Nothing detectable to the human eye. A nudge here, a slight delay there, and the ripples began. The aides in covert discussion miscommunicated. A faction hesitated in executing orders. Another acted prematurely. The circle's internal balance began to tilt. She leaned back in her chair. The storm wasn't chaos. It was structure in motion. Human currents, ambition, and fear interweaving in patterns she now understood. A whisper in the shadows. A shadow on a monitor. Someone else was learning too. Someone else was watching. And she had just discovered the key lever. At the same time, another argument erupted. One aide accused another of hiding reports that could shift decisions, influence loyalty, and alter the definition of normal. The room pulsed with frustration, suspicion, unease, and through it all, Lila traced the opportunities. Every misstep revealed a vulnerability. Every hesitation revealed intent. Every raised voice revealed fear. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard, not yet acting, but watching, always watching. For all who dared to observe, adapt, and act, the currents had become alive. The dominoes were no longer stationary. And Lila had placed the first few strategically. The East Wing would never be the same. The trust, the alliances, the subtle betrayals all shifting, all alive. And the real story hadn't even started. The quiet scheming had a fault line. A misstep, small, almost invisible, but enough to fracture confidence. Two aides, previously in alignment, made a mistake. A report sent to the wrong inbox. A timestamp altered incorrectly. A hesitation that should have gone unnoticed. It was noticed, not by the circle at large, not yet, but by one observant mind, someone who had been watching the currents carefully, and suddenly the covert alliance was exposed. Not completely, not definitively, but enough to seed doubt, enough to force caution, enough to scramble strategies. Lila Mercer felt the thrill, not danger, not panic, clarity. The storm she had learned to navigate was now reacting to her. Every misstep, every hesitation, every whispered suspicion was a tool she could use. She leaned forward, adjusted her console, a subtle reroute of communication, a small misalignment in a directive, and the effect was immediate. The first cracks in the exposed alliance widened, the factions flinched, trust fractured further, the currents shifted invisibly but inevitably. You've seen this before, she thought. The moment when control is tested, when influence is no longer hypothetical, when the storm bends to your understanding. Voices rose down the hall, accusations muttered under breath, eyes darted. The circle was alive. Every reaction was a signal, every hesitation a key, and Lila knew the stakes. One wrong move could expose her. One miscalculation could undo everything. Yet she acted, confident, calculated, strategic in ways no one else could trace. Somewhere in the shadows, someone else was aware, watching, calculating, learning. The currents were no longer hers alone, but she had the first insight, the first advantage. The lights flickered, a door clicked, the tension became tangible. Every corner of the East Wing seemed to hum. The storm wasn't over, not even close, and the real story hadn't even started. The East Wing hummed with friction. Not loud, not obvious, but the currents were shifting. Every hesitation, every glance, every whispered word was a pulse in a system alive with tension. Lila Mercer watched it all. The first cracks she had nudged were now fractures. Subtle misalignments had multiplied. Trust faltered. Alliances wavered. The circle was reacting, and reacting imperfectly. Then, a new variable appeared. A presence she hadn't anticipated. Someone moving carefully, deliberately, observing her movements. Not openly challenging, not yet, but measuring. Her pulse didn't spike, her breath didn't quicken. She had anticipated storms, she had learned to read currents, and now she read opposition. A misrouted memo ignited quiet panic. Faction A acted prematurely. Faction B hesitated. Faction C moved to intervene. The web of influence twisted in unexpected directions. She traced it across her monitors. Every response, every hesitation, every subtle misstep was now a data point, a signal, a lever she could use. "You've felt this before," she reminded herself. The moment when chaos becomes opportunity, when human error reveals the rhythm beneath the system, when influence becomes leverage. Down the corridor, doors clicked, footsteps approached, then receded. Voices whispered, careful not to be overheard. The currents were alive. The storm was no longer just observation, it was engagement. Her console pinged, a detail she hadn't noticed before. A subtle pattern in the movements of her unseen rival. Not enough to reveal intent, but enough to anticipate it. She adjusted the flows, rerouted communication, shifted subtle timings, and watched the response cascade. Faction A faltered. Faction B overextended. Faction C hesitated, uncertain. The balance tipped quietly, invisibly, dangerously. Lila leaned back, absorbing the rhythm. The storm was no longer her own creation. It was interaction, it was consequence. It was a living network of ambition, fear, and hidden agendas. The lights flickered, monitors blinked. A shadow passed across a hallway camera. The circle had noticed the currents. Someone was testing them, testing her, and the real story hadn't even started. And she had just discovered the key lever. At the same time, another argument erupted. One aide accused another of hiding reports that could shift decisions, influence loyalty, and alter the definition of normal. The room pulsed with frustration, suspicion, unease, and through it all, Lila traced the opportunities. Every misstep revealed a vulnerability. Every hesitation revealed intent. Every raised voice revealed fear. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard, not yet acting, but watching, always watching. For all who dared to observe, adapt, and act, the East Wing was quieter than usual. Too quiet. The hum of monitors and machines seemed sharper, almost deliberate. Every shadow carried weight. Every footstep carried intent. Lila Musa sensed it immediately. Someone was probing, testing boundaries, challenging the currents she had so carefully calibrated. A senior aide approached her console, voice low, controlled. "Have you noticed the discrepancies?" She didn't flinch, didn't answer immediately. Observation first, calculation second. The discrepancies weren't random, they weren't errors, they were tests. And she recognized the signature immediately. Someone skilled, deliberate, strategic. Down the corridor, factional tension escalated. Two groups argued over timing. Another group questioned the authority of directives. The first overt cracks of rebellion appeared not open defiance, but controlled chaos. Lila's pulse remained steady. Her fingers hovered, then moved. A subtle adjustment. A small reroute of data. Just enough to observe the reactions. The first countermove came almost immediately. A document appeared in the wrong folder. A timestamp misaligned. The faction she had subtly influenced stumbled. The opposition gained ground. She smiled faintly. This was the moment she had anticipated. The first direct confrontation. The first test of her leverage. And the first insight into her rival's rhythm. "You've seen this before," she whispered. The thrill of engagement. The pulse of influence. the moment when observation and action collide. Down the hall, doors clicked, voices whispered, accusations carried in undercurrents. The circle was alive. The currents were visible now. The storm had shifted from subtlety to interaction. Lila traced patterns across her monitors. Every hesitation, every raised eyebrow, every carefully measured response data, leverage, opportunity. Her rival stepped closer, careful not to reveal intent. A shadow, a ghost in the system, someone who understood the currents as well as she did, someone who could undo her delicate manipulations. Yet she remained calm, calculated, observant, because storms could not be destroyed. They could only be navigated. The lights flickered. A door clicked shut somewhere down the hall. The first direct confrontation had begun, and the real story hadn't even started. The storm had gained momentum, not in shouts or alarms, not in chaos, but in precision, quiet, relentless, unstoppable. Lila Mercer leaned over her console. Every monitor flickered with streams of data, every movement a pulse in the living organism of the circle. She wasn't just observing anymore, she was influencing, shaping outcomes without leaving fingerprints. A misrouted directive caused the first ripple of panic. Faction A hesitated. Faction B misinterpreted. Faction C acted too quickly. The currents twisted and turned unpredictably, yet exactly as Lila had anticipated. You felt this before, she thought. The thrill of leverage. The power of invisible influence. The awareness that one subtle shift could change everything. But the consequences were no longer contained. An outside observer, a consultant from another department, noticed anomalies. Small questions were asked. Investigations quietly initiated. The storm was leaking. Lila adjusted. A subtle reroute, a timestamp realignment, a micro-hook to draw attention elsewhere. The ripple spread. Focus shifted. The leak contained itself temporarily. Down the corridor, the factions' tensions boiled over. A misstep became an argument. An argument became accusation. A whisper became suspicion. The East Wing trembled with invisible pressure. Her rival, quiet, deliberate, calculating, made a move. Not overt, not yet, but precise, measured. A subtle adjustment in the communications flow, Lila noticed immediately. A spike on the monitor, a hesitation in a faction's movement, a misaligned reaction to an instruction. The storm was no longer hers alone. It was interaction. It was engagement. It was living strategy. Yet she remained calm. Observation first, influence second, calculation third. Lights flickered above. A door clicked down the hall. Footsteps paused, then resumed. The currents were alive. She traced the misalignment back to its source. Not fully identifiable, but precise enough to anticipate the next move. The factions were dancing without realizing it. The storm had a rhythm now, and Lila was learning it. The first major consequences were appearing outside her sphere. Miscommunications, delays, tensions that could not be ignored. The circle was no longer insulated. The storm was expanding. And the real story hadn't even started. And she had just discovered the key lever. At the same time, another argument erupted. One aide accused another of hiding reports that could shift decisions, influence loyalty, and alter the definition of normal. The room pulsed with frustration, suspicion, unease, and through it all, Lila traced the opportunities. Every misstep revealed a vulnerability. Every hesitation revealed intent. Every raised voice revealed fear. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard, not yet acting, but watching, always watching. For all who dared to observe, adapt, and act. The East Wing had changed. not in structure, not in walls, but in energy. The currents were visible now. Pressure built with every glance, every whisper, every measured step. Lila Mercer observed quietly. The subtle manipulations she had perfected were beginning to provoke open resistance, not outright defiance, yet, but the first cracks had become audible. A faction leader stepped forward, voice sharp, eyes calculating. This isn't working. Someone is interfering. The room froze. Every whisper paused. Every glance measured. Lila didn't flinch. She leaned back, calm, calculating. Observation first, interpretation second, action third. The storm she had initiated now reacted to her. The currents had agency. The first ripple of rebellion flowed in her direction. You've seen this before, she reminded herself. The moment when influence is challenged. The thrill of the first pushback. The first test of true control. Down the corridor, doors clicked. Footsteps echoed. Deliberate. Voices murmured, strategies, alliances forming in real time. The factions were adapting, learning, testing each other. A misrouted report caused hesitation in Faction B. Faction A overstepped. Faction C shifted loyalties quietly. The tension in the room was electric. Lila's rival moved closer, not openly confronting, but precise in timing. A subtle redirection of information. A shadow manipulating shadows. She adjusted her console. A timestamp here, a micro nudge there. The storm bent once again to her understanding. Not perfectly, not without risk, but the rhythm was hers to read. The first faction's challenge had a consequence. A second faction began questioning the chain of command. A third prepared to act but hesitated. The currents rippled outward, unpredictable yet measurable. Lila absorbed the data. Every pause, every hesitation, every shift in tone was a lever, a tool, a signal. The storm was alive. It was no longer subtle. And the real story hadn't even started. The lights flickered. A door clicked shut. Somewhere, a shadow observed, learning. The East Wing was no longer a room. It was a network, a battlefield, and she was only beginning to understand its rules. The East Wing pulsed with urgency. Time seemed to contract. Every second carried weight. Every whisper carried risk. The currents moved faster now, unpredictable, alive. Lila Mercer monitored every thread. Every glance, every hesitation, every misalignment was data. Every subtle betrayal or alliance shift was leverage. Every move was a choice. Faction A made a misstep. Orders were executed out of sequence. A directive contradicted a prior instruction. The room stiffened with tension. Faction B noticed, hesitated, recalculated. Faction C exploited the uncertainty. Trust fractured further. Small alliances wavered. The storm was no longer subtle, it was escalating. You felt this before, she whispered to herself. The surge of tension, the thrill of observation turning into strategy, the awareness that control was measured in moments, not intentions. Then an unexpected variable. A senior observer from outside the circle entered the East Wing. Eyes scanning, voice quiet but precise. Questions asked that could expose patterns, undermine manipulations, raise alarms. Lila's fingers hovered, her pulse remained steady. She adjusted a subtle reroute here, a micro delay there, a redirection of attention. The currents bent. The observer noticed anomalies, but not enough to trace the source. Down the corridors, alliances shifted again. Factional leaders recalculated loyalties. A whispered suggestion prompted hesitation. A misinterpreted message sparked suspicion. The storm expanded. The pressure multiplied. Lila absorbed it all. The stakes had grown. Every ripple could escalate into a wave. Every hesitation could betray her. Every advantage could slip. yet she remained poised. Because storms were not destroyed, they were navigated. Because influence was not force, it was rhythm. Because she had learned to read the currents before they became torrents, the lights flickered, a door clicked. The east wing vibrated with tension. The circle was no longer a room, it was a living organism, and she was only beginning to understand its pulse. The first consequences beyond the room appeared. Miscommunication across departments, delays in critical tasks, friction that could no longer be ignored, and the real story hadn't even started. The East Wing erupted, not in shouts or alarms, not in chaos visible to outsiders, but in deliberate, jagged movements. Factional fractures became undeniable. A miscommunication spiraled. Alliances snapped. Subtle betrayals became bold gestures. Lila Mercer leaned over her console, calm, calculating. The storm she had orchestrated was now living on its own. For all who dared to observe, adapt, and act, every error, every hesitation, every blink of panic was a tool she could exploit. You felt this once, didn't you? She reminded herself. The pulse of influence. The thrill of opportunity when chaos meets strategy. Faction A accused Faction B of intentional interference. Faction B countered with evidence she hadn't even seen. Faction C hesitated, weighing loyalties, eyes darting between missteps and possible alliances. Down the corridor, a senior aide whispered into a monitor. Another adjusted a timestamp, uncertain if it was correction or sabotage. The currents twisted, unpredictable, alive. And then her rival made a direct move, not subtle, not hidden, calculated, visible, precise. A redirection of communication meant to destabilize her leverage. Lila didn't flinch. She observed, measured, mapped the rhythm, a small adjustment here, a micro nudge there, and the storm bent again, responding to her touch. The fracture widened. Faction A moved prematurely. Faction B overextended. Faction C chose a side hesitant, but committed. The East Wing vibrated with tension, every interaction a spark, every hesitation a fuse. Lila traced the consequences. Every reaction outside her sphere was a signal. Every ripple beyond the room, a wave she could anticipate. You've seen this before, she whispered. The thrill of control, tempered by risk. The awareness that storms could be navigated but never fully tamed. Footsteps echoed down the hall, doors clicked, voices carried strategies and accusations, every shadow held intent, every pause held opportunity. The East Wing was no longer a room, it was a battlefield of currents, alliances, and ambition. And Lila had learned to read its pulse, but her rival was learning too. And the real story hadn't even started. The East Wing was electric. Every glance, every step, every whispered word carried weight. Factional tension had reached a fever pitch. Every misalignment now amplified into consequence. Lila Mercer observed silently. Her rival's maneuvers had become clearer, deliberate, calculated, but still traceable. Every shift, every hesitation, every misstep, all mapped across her monitors. You've felt this before, she whispered. The rush of invisible influence. The thrill of observing chaos bending to strategy. Faction A faltered under pressure. A directive misread. A timing misjudged. And their position weakened instantly. Faction B hesitated, unsure whether to capitalize or guard against further missteps. Faction C watched, poised to intervene, yet wary of committing too early. Lila acted, a micro-nudge of information, a subtle delay, a redirection of focus. The currents bent again, the fractures widened. Outside the East Wing, ripples began to appear. Miscommunication spread into other departments. Deadlines shifted. Urgency rose. The storm she had cultivated was now spilling outward. affecting more than she had initially intended. Her rival's presence was felt more keenly now. Every calculated move countered by subtle adjustments from Lila. The battle was no longer about secrecy, it was about rhythm. Who could anticipate, adapt, and act first? Footsteps echoed down the corridors. Doors clicked open and shut with purpose. Whispers became conversations. Conversations became decisions. The East Wing had become a living organism, thrumming with ambition, fear, and intent. The storm was no longer hers alone. It was interaction. It was engagement. It was consequence. And still, the real story hadn't even started. The ripple had become a wave, not confined to the East Wing anymore. Every department felt it. Every line of command trembled. Lila Mercer watched, silent, calculating. What began as subtle nudges had now sparked consequences beyond her design. Delays, miscommunications, minor conflicts, all multiplying faster than she could trace. Faction A openly accused Faction B of sabotage. Faction B defended itself with evidence that seemed incontrovertible. Faction C hesitated, torn between loyalty and self-interest. The fractures were no longer subtle, they were visible. "You've seen this before," Lila whispered. "The moment when influence collides with consequence, when power bends against ambition, when strategy faces its first moral test, a new variable emerged, a whistleblower, someone who had observed anomalies and chose to act. Their revelation was small, a misplaced report, a subtle misalignment, but enough to ignite uncertainty and doubt. Lila felt the weight immediately. This wasn't just leverage. This wasn't just strategy. This was choice. She could intervene, redirect the flow, cover her tracks, maintain control, or she could let it play out. Allow the truth, however small, to ripple. Test the integrity of her influence. See how factions truly responded under pressure. Her fingers hovered. Every second carried gravity. Every micro-decision could determine the next wave. The East Wing vibrated with tension. Footsteps echoed. For all who dared to observe, adapt, and act. Doors clicked. Voices whispered, argued, calculated. The storm was alive. The storm was ethical. The storm was consequence. And Lila understood the choice she faced: to control or to observe, to dominate or to test, to maintain power or to see how far influence could reach. Without breaking entirely, the currents pulsed. The first major fallout was undeniable, and the real story hadn't even started. The East Wing trembled, not from chaos, but from calculated pressure. Every whispered suspicion, every hesitant glance, every misaligned directive had become forceful currents, pulling the factions in unpredictable directions. Lila Mercer observed, calm, deliberate. The storm she had nurtured was no longer subtle. It had become a living, breathing entity, one that tested loyalties, ambitions, and human instinct alike. "You've seen this before," she murmured. The moment when influence becomes exposure, when strategy meets consequence, when the delicate web of control begins to unravel, hidden alliances emerged. Faction A reached silently toward Faction C. Faction B attempted to reclaim ground. Faction D, previously unnoticed, inserted itself into the fray, its motives obscure, its influence growing. The East Wing had become a theater of quiet conflict. Every action now carried amplified risk. Every hesitation could be weaponized. Then the high-stakes choice. A critical decision loomed. A directive she could manipulate, a choice that could cement her control or fracture it entirely. Her fingers hovered over the console. The data streams pulsed like a heartbeat. Every ripple of movement, every hesitation, every misstep was now magnified beyond her immediate perception. She could tighten control, force the factions to realign, risking exposure and rebellion. Or she could let the currents run free, seeing which alliances would hold, which would fracture, and how influence truly played out under pressure. The East Wing held its breath. Footsteps echoed. Doors clicked. Conversations paused, then resumed with careful calculation. Every whisper, Every glance, every subtle gesture was amplified by anticipation. The storm pulsed. The fractures widened. The hidden alliances revealed themselves, and she could either exploit them or let them dictate the outcome. Lila's decision would define the circle's future. Not just the East Wing, but every current, every connection, every ripple of influence. The pulse quickened, the tension tightened. The real story hadn't even started. Yet here, on this precipice, everything could change. The East Wing held its breath. Every monitor, every line of communication, every shadowed corner was alive with consequence. The storm had reached its zenith. Not loud, not chaotic, but undeniable, relentless, complete. Lila Mercer watched it all, calm, deliberate. The fractures, the alliances, the betrayals, every ripple, every pulse had led here. And now the currents no longer obeyed her. They had become their own rhythm, their own force. You felt this before, she whispered, the recognition of truth hidden in chaos. The realization that power was never absolute, influence was never total, and control was always an illusion. Faction A faltered, exposed. Faction B seized opportunity but misjudged its timing. Faction C reacted too slowly. Faction D revealed motives previously unseen. Every player moved, stumbled, misstepped, and the currents carried the consequences beyond anyone's anticipation. Her rival emerged, finally direct, finally visible. A silent acknowledgement passed between them. No words, no threats, just recognition. They had both tested the system, and now the system was testing them. Lila reflected. The storm had taught her more than strategy, more than manipulation. It had revealed human truths, the fragility of trust, the inevitability of ambition, the paradox of influence. To bend the currents, one must first understand them, but understanding never guarantees control. The lights flickered, doors clicked, footsteps echoed like a heartbeat. The East Wing was alive with reflection and consequence. Freedom of choice, fragility of trust, the weight of ambition, these were the currents she had navigated. And yet, there was quiet, a space between decisions, a moment for reflection, a chance to understand that storms do not end, they evolve. The factions were realigned, some fractured, some strengthened, some changed entirely. The consequences had rippled far beyond the room. The currents, once subtle, were now visible, undeniable, alive. Lila leaned back, letting the weight settle. The East Wing pulsed quietly. A final whisper of clarity. Control is an illusion. Influence is a rhythm. And humanity is always the storm. She exhaled slowly. The currents had revealed their truth. And maybe this was where everything began again. For all who dare to observe, adapt, and act,